Good evening and welcome to Capital Report on NTD. Here's what's coming up. President Trump speaking out after the shooting at Fort Stewart. What he's saying tonight, plus new punishment for India over his ties with Russia and a massive move from Apple. The latest on efforts for peace in the Ukraine-Russia war as the U.S. Special Envoy meets with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Why President Trump is calling the meeting highly productive. And how has China used America's open trade system against us? And how can we mitigate the risk? We'll speak with former U.S. Ambassador Joseph Cella. And President Trump floating a federal takeover of Washington, D.C. Are city residents on board with the idea? We'll hear from the people.
This is Capital Report, live from our global headquarters in our nation's capital. Here's Steve Lance.
I'm Iris Howe in for Steve Lance tonight. The Army has identified a suspect who opened fire earlier today at Fort Stewart, Georgia, injuring 5 soldiers. The general who commands the Army's 3rd Infantry Division explains what happened.
Shortly before 11 o'clock, an active duty soldier assigned to Fort Stewart, Georgia, shot and wounded 5 of his fellow soldiers here on Fort Stewart. Thankfully, all are in stable condition and all are expected to recover. The alleged shooter is in custody. We have reestablished security. I have lifted all lockdown measures on Fort Stewart, and there is currently no threat to the local community.
The Army identified a suspect as 28-year-old Sergeant Cornelius Radford, an automated logistics sergeant. He has not previously been deployed to combat, and the Army says is not aware of any prior disciplinary or behavioral issues he may have had. The Army said the shooting occurred at the soldier's workplace and involved his co-workers. Radford is now in custody awaiting charges. The Army has not established a motive and is actively investigating the case. And President Trump is doubling tariffs on India and announcing that Apple would invest another $100 billion in the U.S. For the latest, we go live to NTD's Washington correspondent Mari Otsu at the White House. Good evening, Mari. First of all, on the shooting at Fort Stewart, what's the president saying tonight?
Good evening to you, Iris. Yes, President Trump actually began his Oval Office announcement tonight commemorating the wounded victims of the shooting in Georgia this morning. Take a look.
And the Army Criminal Investigation Division is on site to ensure that the perpetrator of this atrocity, which is exactly what it is, will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The entire nation is praying for the victims and their families, and hopefully they'll fully recover. And we can put this chapter behind, but we're not going to forget what happened.
The 5 soldiers were treated on base, are now in stable condition, and are expected to recover. Iris.
And Mari, as the president today speaks to reporters and the people, what is he saying on trade? Any update on the tariffs with India?
Yes, President Trump signed an executive order this morning that doubles tariffs on imports from India to 50%. This extra 25% tariff punishes India for its purchases of Russian oil and will take effect on August 27th. This EO signing comes 2 days before President Trump's deadline for Russia to end the war with Ukraine or face hefty sanctions. Here's the president on the India tariff tonight. Take a look.
And as you know, we put a 50% tariff on India. On oil, they're the 2nd largest. They're very close to China in terms of the purchase of oil from Russia. But so I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but we've had very productive talks today.
This extra tariff comes as Indian Prime Minister Modi is reportedly planning to visit China at the end of August for the first time in over 7 years. The last time the leaders of India and China spoke was on the sidelines of the BRICS summit back in October. President Trump has threatened to impose an additional 10% tariff on members of the BRICS group, which includes India and China, for, quote, aligning themselves with anti-American policies. China is the #1 buyer of Russian energy, sparking criticism from lawmakers that it's fueling Russia's war machine. Back to you.
And Mara, today Apple CEO Tim Cook was also at the White House with President Trump. Tell us more about the major investment announcement.
Yes, Iris, President Trump announced in the Oval Office this evening that Apple will invest an additional $100 billion in the U.S. Apple CEO Tim Cook was present at the announcement. This now brings Apple's commitment to the U.S. to over $600 billion over the next 4 years. Most of Apple's iPhones have historically been manufactured in China, and production is now increasing in India, which is something that President Trump has recently criticized. So he told Cook tonight that he wants Apple to build in the U.S. Take a look.
Apple's been an investor in other countries a little bit. I won't say which ones, but a couple. And they're coming home. $600 billion. It's the biggest there is.
Apple is leading the creation of an end-to-end silicon supply chain right here in America, from design to equipment to wafer production to fabrication to packaging.
The announcement included the launch of Apple's so-called American Manufacturing Program, which will bring more of its supply chain and high-tech manufacturing to the U.S. Tim Cook also said tonight that Apple is proud to lead an end-to-end supply chain right here in America, mentioning that every single Apple iPhone and new Apple Watch will contain glass made in Kentucky. Iris, back to you.
Well, definitely the latest in the string of investments that President Trump is announcing in the U.S. Thanks for the update, Mari. And President Trump today saying that there is a good chance that he'll meet with Russia's Vladimir Putin very soon. It comes after Trump says the U.S. has some good talks with Putin earlier today. NED's international correspondent Arian Pastor has an update on the peace efforts.
A motorcade believed to be carrying U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff left the Kremlin on Wednesday. President Trump says Witkoff had a highly productive meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Trump added that great progress was made. Afterwards, I updated some of our European allies. Everyone agrees this war must come to a close. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy was on the call with Trump and European allies as well on Wednesday. According to Zelenskyy, Putin is more open to peace talks after Wednesday's meeting with Witkoff.
We discussed what was said in Moscow. It appears that Russia is now more inclined to consider a ceasefire. The pressure on them is working.
Russia's foreign policy advisor says the meeting lasted 3 hours.
When it comes to its topics, first of all, it was the Ukraine crisis. And the second topic was possible development of strategic cooperation between the U.S. and Russia.
Trump is now open to meet with Putin to discuss possible peace solutions. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt tells NTD's sister media, The Epoch Times, that the Russians expressed their desire to meet with President Trump, and the president is open to meeting with both President Putin and President Zelenskyy. President Trump wants this brutal war to end. The developments come just 2 days before a deadline for Russia to strike a peace deal with Ukraine. Trump says he'll increase economic pressure on Moscow if no deal is reached by Friday. Arian Pastar, NTD News.
What's driving the U.S. to compete with China over Little Island in the Pacific? The State Department has started seabed mineral talks with the Cook Islands, a country with ties to New Zealand. NED's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley has more.
The U.S. is partnering with the Cook Islands to conduct research on seabed minerals. The Pacific Island country sits atop a seabed that's reportedly rich in critical minerals, and it's also subject to influence by the Chinese Communist Party. The announcement was made on the Cook Islands' 60th anniversary. They said in a joint statement on Tuesday that U.S.-linked firms sit at the forefront of deep seabed mineral research and exploration in the Cook Islands, which reflects strong and shared U.S. Cook Islands seabed mineral interests. Last week, the FBI opened a new office in Wellington, New Zealand, which oversees the Cook Islands, and it's opened to counter the CCP's regional influence, cybercrime, and espionage. That's what FBI Director Kash Patel said at the time, that countering the CCP is a top priority both for the U.S. and New Zealand.
Putting us together in common space and sharing with intelligence platforms and law enforcement partners and defense operations is the only way we are going to actually countermand the CCP threat that is dominating the Indo-PACOM region.
That's as concerns arose earlier this year over the Cook Islands' deepening ties with China. Their prime minister went to China in February and signed a trade and seabed mining agreement with the CCP. But New Zealand's leaders were unhappy that they weren't informed about this, as the two countries share constitutional ties. And in June, New Zealand suspended $11 million to the Cook Islands in development funding. China has been working to tie itself to several island nations for rare earth minerals. China supplies about 90% of the world's rare earths and also dominates in producing many critical minerals. Analysts say that if China were to ban exports of these minerals to the U.S., the consequences could be economically catastrophic.
So a total export ban would be devastating to the U.S. economy. We would need to rely on domestic sources if we can get them online, and to turn to allies as much as possible.
So right now, the U.S. is looking into alternatives like its trading partners in the Indo-Pacific, Japan, Australia, and also mining here at home.
We have vast mineral resources here. A lot of people do not understand how much we actually have.
Last month, for instance, the Pentagon agreed to invest $400 million in a stake in MP Materials, America's largest rare earth mine. For NTD News, I'm Jack Bradley.
How does American dependence on China make us more vulnerable, and how can we mitigate the risk? Joseph Cella, principal of the Pontifex Group, sat down with NTD's Steve Lance today to discuss these developments. Cella is also the former U.S. ambassador to Fiji and other Pacific Island nations.
Ambassador Joseph Cella, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for the opportunity, Steve. Great to be with you.
It's really great to have you, Ambassador. You have a lot of experience in the South Pacific, in that region. When it comes to China, how does the Chinese Communist Party use our open trade and investment systems ultimately to work against us?
They really miss no opportunity to exploit our free and open system from the Indo-Pacific to the shores of the United States of America. And no matter the sector or strata, I saw it firsthand when in Fiji. I've seen it on the front lines here in Michigan in any number of ways. And it's important we, in a whole of society, whole of government manner, scale to be on the footing to counter those threats.
What are some of your biggest concerns in terms of examples of our own dependence on China and how it can actually make our country more vulnerable?
Sure, Steve. I think you can look at a couple of very contemporaneous instances. I think you look at the critical minerals supply chain. President Trump and Secretary Hegseth recognize it and move boldly and swiftly to engage in the partial acquisition of MP Materials in California so that we could have our supply chain bolstered for these instances that have military applications, because you do not want to be overly dependent on China or any other rogue regime during a time of war or other unrest.
And to that point, talk to us, if you could, a little bit about the CCP's Belt and Road Initiative and really their focus on those critical minerals in Africa over the past couple of decades. Most of the time, while we were sort of caught up and tied up with the war on terror and not able to give Africa as much attention.
Yeah, I think, and I would say not only Africa, but the Indo-Pacific as well, and elsewhere, even South America. So that was a generation plus, I would say, that we distracted, we were engaged, and again, put our footing further off from the threat from China. So you can see how in Congo, not only do they exploit labor, but they exploit the materials and are ripping the people of Congo off. I know there's some efforts privately and within the State Department under Secretary Rubio to bolster that and end that and make them less vulnerable and thus the world, and certainly support the dignity of their workers.
These investments and partnerships that the CCP is making, they're not really happening in the abstract. They're happening in all states. Talk to us about what is going on in your home state of Michigan and how it has a tangible impact.
Well, real time, there was a convening, Steve, in February of 22 of state and local government elected officials on a bipartisan basis with our intelligence agencies saying, look, China's on the hunt. You better be ready. And because of their exploitative ways and because of our open system, they've taken full advantage of that. In Michigan, they've given some, in that meeting, they gave some pointers for them to follow. Business leaders were also present, Steve. And they said, these may be seemingly benign business deals, but don't be too careful. You must exercise strict scrutiny, due diligence, operate transparently, make sure that these deals have integrity. And in Michigan, Governor Whitmer and others on the state and local and county level economic development agencies did exactly the opposite to bring in very high-risk deals with two China-based, Chinese Communist Party-tied companies, Goshen and Cattle, to manufacture EV batteries and systems. They flaunted these warnings to our peril, and one is in greater jeopardy than the other, but it is a textbook example of a subnational incursion, and those on the local and state and county level, even some of our congressional delegation initially were not aware. But once educational engagement happened by the citizens as to the nature of these corrupted deals, they pounced, and we've met with great success.
Now, Ambassador, there seems to be two frames of thought in Washington when it comes to China, maybe more. But most recently, you hear China being referred to as a competitor or an adversary. Some folks say and talk about de-risking from China as opposed to decoupling. What do you think we need to do to completely mitigate the risk from China?
Now, I would posit that we're in a Cold War with China. I would say it's much more complex than it was with the Soviet Union, because with the Soviets, we were not economically intertwined. We're not intertwined academically and in a host of ways. Those gaps need to be shored up. I think it is imperative that we decouple when it comes to military and space and other critical minerals and technology to provide for our common defense. And I think decouple in other areas such as, or de-risk in other areas such as academia and as well as the EV battery realm, because that leaves us wide open. By mandate, the national intelligence law, national security law of China requires Chinese nationals to surveil, collect, and report as directed or on their own volition. So when they're a part of these deals or they're present in academia, they can do much, and they have here in Michigan, whether it's the University of Michigan, scholars smuggling in biological agents, or some graduate students that spied on Camp Grayling during live fire military exercises when Taiwanese troops were present. So it is high time for us to scale. I'm happy to see what FBI Director Kash Patel has done, and Secretary of Defense Hegseth, President Trump, to engage on these known threats.
A lot of very important points that you just made there. Former Ambassador Joseph Cella, really appreciate your perspective.
Thanks for the opportunity to share with you, Steve.
And President Trump floating a federal takeover of the nation's capital. This comes after a former DOJ staffer was ambushed and assaulted by a group of teens here in D.C. Are city residents on board with the idea? NTD's Sam Wong was in the Navy Yard area of D.C. today to hear from the people.
You feel safe being in the city? I do. I feel safe being in the city. I know it has its ups and downs, but for overall, I do feel safe being in the city.
I noticed on Friday nights there's a ton of police presence on the wharf because they're underage kids. That's kind of scary when you see that many cops, which is good, but something's going on.
I come around often. I'm pretty out on this side often, but I never experienced any trouble with anybody.
There were a couple of big incidents where large crowds of kids showed up. I didn't see those. They seem to have deterred those recently with lights and more cops. on the weekends when that would happen.
I speak to the community quite often, and a lot of people have very bad experiences, including a friend of mine who just saw two teenagers this morning at 6 a.m. with a gun and ski masks on, getting ready to rob someone. As I was saying, the CVS right here has actually been robbed a couple of times.
President Trump was talking about federalizing the city if this crime situation doesn't get resolved. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think it's a bad idea. I heard about how he wants to stop basically teenagers, charging them as adults, if I'm not mistaken. In D.C., I think a lot of kids know they can get away with it at a certain age. By the time they're 18, you hit juvenile, and no matter what you did, you got a scot-free clean record. That can be a problem.
I think policing in any city is best handled locally.
Everybody has their right to opinion. Public safety is the most important thing.
The feds should not take over the city. Absolutely not. I mean, yes, we do come upon difficult situations, but we don't need them to help us.
Clearly, the mayor, as well as the people in charge of the districts, or the wards as we call them here in D.C., have not done their job well. So I can only hope that a federal interference, if you will, could be effective, because something needs to be done.
How has the focus of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department shifted under President Trump? And what are the biggest challenges and the types of cases the department is tackling?
There's so many things that we're seeing where people's rights are being violated. I kind of jokingly say when someone comes into my office, oh no, what fresh hell is this? Because there's always some crazy new problem, but it's actually a joy for creative lawyers to come together and try to help solve these problems. We started out by making sure that everyone here who worked at the Civil Rights Division knew that the rules had changed. Unfortunately, that led 3/4 of them to quit because they were used to doing things a certain way, didn't want to change. And so we're having to rebuild person by person the Civil Rights Division.
Tomorrow on Capitol Report, hear more from Harmeet Dillon, Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Justice. And coming up, Apple investing $100 billion more in American manufacturing after pressure to move production away from China. We'll hear a reaction from Florida Republican Congressman Mike Herodopoulos live in studio. And Texas Democratic lawmakers evacuate their hotel after a bomb threat, as the Texas governor and attorney general are pushing to oust them. One U.S. senator is looking to get the FBI involved. More on that after the break.